Do you have a hard time understanding Pope Francis and what he's up to? Are you wondering what he's trying to accomplish? What if I told you that a secret group of leftist cardinals conspired to elect Pope Francis, contravening rules for papal elections? Well, some of you may have already heard of the Gallen Mafia, but we have with us an amazing journalist, one of the best researchers I know, who has done a deep dive into the inner workings of this Gallen Mafia. And what is most startling is how their stated agenda falls totally in line with the Francis papacy. And it's in fact the best way to make sense of the Francis papacy. This is the John Henry Westen Show. You're going to want to stay tuned. Hello, LifeSite friends. To celebrate the momentous overturning of Roe v. Wade, we at LifeSite have minted just under 10,000 brand new limited edition pro-life silver rounds. Each round is stamped on the back with an image of the Supreme Court of the United States featuring the date that the High Court delivered this historic victory. And on the front of our pure silver rounds, we feature LifeSite's logo, surrounded by brilliant sunburst and draped with olive branches, and each round commemorates LifeSite's 25 years of pro-life, pro-family reporting in America, Canada, and beyond. These 1 troy ounce rounds are 0.999 pure silver, and LifeSite has just under 10,000 in stock. They're beautiful, historic, and forever enshrining the most important American pro-life victory of a generation. This first edition LifeSite silver round is the perfect gift for yourself or anyone you love that collects precious metals and is passionately pro-life. And each purchase helps directly fund LifeSite's pro-life and pro-family mission. This is the first precious metals collectible of its kind that is directly supporting LifeSite's worldwide mission that you know, love, and trust. And now it can be yours while limited supplies last. Get your 1 troy ounce rounds of 99% pure silver today by clicking the first link below and celebrate life with all of us at LifeSite News. Julia Maloney, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's begin as we always do with the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Julia, you're very familiar to me because I think you're honestly one of the best researchers that I know. You have a graduate degree from Yale University, and then, undergrad from Yale, and then a master's from Harvard in English. Your research and writing has been impeccable. When you were doing this book, I was eagerly awaiting its publication. So we're there now. And if you wouldn't mind, let's start with a very basic question for you. But what is the Gallen Mafia, or who is the Gallen Mafia?
So it's a group of high-ranking churchmen, and they started meeting at or near St. Gallen, Switzerland in the mid-1990s. 1996 is usually the date we're given for when they officially start. And the figurehead, the dominant personality of the group is Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini. And he had been a Jesuit biblical scholar, and then he became the Archbishop of Milan. And in the 1990s, he was kind of seen as the next pope. At least the world wanted him to be the next pope after Pope John Paul II. And he gave some prominent interviews where he kind of signaled that he was a little flexible, let's say, on things like contraception and women priests and that sort of thing, kind of just hinting, having a kind of ambiguity that's very suggestive. You could even call it Jesuitical, the way that he would answer questions. So it's right around the same time that that talk of him is being bandied about as the next pope, that he founds this group called the St. Gallen Mafia. And the then bishop of that area in Switzerland, Ivo Führer, was the person who would host these meetings. And some of the other dominant personalities would be Cardinal Walter Kasper, and he's very familiar to us. He's the German theologian who, of course, had the Kasper proposal for communion for the divorced and civilly remarried. He was there. Cardinal he wasn't a cardinal then, but Karl Lehmann, another German, he was actually an assistant at one time to Karl Rahner, one of the dominant towering figures of the Second Vatican Council. So a lot of these people, they were kind of like they were like the heirs to the Vatican II big personalities. And there were other figures that came in. Cardinal Achilles Silvestrini was an important one, and he was an Italian diplomat, and he was very kind of scheming, maneuvering, and he came into the group in, I believe, 2003, because Martini, the man who should have become the next pope, he got Parkinson's disease. And so he had to leave the group, but he still was kind of this spiritual presence for the group. So even though he formally left allegedly in 2003, he remains kind of the dominant figure throughout all of this.
It's amazing. I believe Cardinal McCarrick was there as well. Is that correct?
McCarrick is usually not named as a technical member of the group, but people have uncovered, especially through interviews with James Grine, who he's kind of the most famous victim of McCarrick. James Grine has talked about how McCarrick spent time in Switzerland, I think in the 1950s. And according to Mr. Grine, McCarrick went to St. Gallen, Switzerland, like every year for like 20 years or something like that. So there's a very, we get to the point where some of this gets very fuzzy and nebulous, and it's in the shadows still. And there's still, frankly, further research that needs to be done to clarify what his role was.
One of the most fascinating things, and this is where I think people really start to get the connection. For most people, figuring out Pope Francis has been one of the most difficult things. I think almost the whole world was at first, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, no real concerns, a few notable exceptions. But, for me anyways, it was like 3 days in. I don't know if you recall, but 3 days in, he first praises Cardinal Casper, the theology of the on the knees comment. And that's when all the red flags went off, at least for us at LifeSite. It was like, whoa, wait a minute. Cardinal Casper was the same guy who fought Pope Benedict all those years ago, while he was still Ratzinger in the CDF, over the issue of communion for the divorced and remarried. But that didn't figure in right away on day 3 of the papacy. It was more like, here's the theologian who's doing such great theology. And we were like, that's kind of strange. Lay out for us, if you will, Cardinal Casper and his connection here to Pope Francis.
We know from interviews that Casper has done, and this is documented in the book. There's like over 600 footnotes, so there's quite a lot of documentation here if people want to look any of this up. But we know from interviews that Casper met Bergoglio when he was a cardinal, I believe, in Argentina, and he actually went back several times and had visits with Bergoglio. So they have this connection, but this really interesting narrative comes up, which kind of ignores that mysterious prior connection that they had, and basically talks about the famous story that in the around the time of the 2013 conclave, Casper had just gotten the Spanish edition of his book Mercy. And so he went to Bergoglio. Bergoglio happened to be like the room across from him. And so he went to Bergoglio and shared it with him. And then allegedly that was kind of like how he got on Bergoglio's radar. So this becomes this kind of legend there. And then that it becomes this explanatory event to account for why Pope Francis is praising him 3 days in. But again, as I said, there appears to have been a prior history of visits. And we know that the mafia was talking about Bergoglio in 2001 because Bergoglio had been one of the synodal officials for the October Synod that they had on collegiality. And he especially impressed Cardinal Godfrey Danneels, who's another important personality in this group. So that's kind of a little bit about that.
It's a very interesting history because what you note about him going to visit Bergoglio, so Casper and Bergoglio are visiting in Argentina, and nevertheless we have this then story as if, it comes, the whole idea and notion of the divorced remarried communion comes from this beautiful exchange. Pope Francis reads Cardinal Casper's work and just is so inspired, gets him to lead off the discussion about that issue of divorced remarriage communion, which then leads to the first extraordinary synod on the family, second synod on the family, Amoris Laetitia, where of course the whole of the church teaching gets turned upside down by Pope Francis, led in a way by Cardinal Casper. But interestingly, they had this connection before. So is this a setup? A setup isn't all that weird because setups are known to happen with Pope Francis. There's a famous story of, Pope Francis taking the bus, of things, but that was a photo op. He gets dropped off when in Argentina, still as cardinal, he gets dropped off a couple of blocks before the rectory so he can be shown to walk there. There's another famous story of him, one of his aides having taken his suitcase, his bag, the Pope's bag, up onto the plane already. And he scolds him and says, no, I know, I wanted to carry it in myself. So there are setups. There's setups big time. We know from when he was in the cafeteria with the cafeteria workers, the Pope went down to meet them. It was all staged. All the cafeteria workers were told they're not allowed to talk to him unless, of course, they're tapped, and then they're supposed to be the ones who talk to him. So there's a lot of setup, unfortunately, that has gone on in the Vatican in recent days. But let's deal with this cardinal that you now brought up, because I think Cardinal Danneels is also a very central figure in this whole thing. And in fact, I might ask it this way. You're calling them the San Gallen Mafia. Don't you think that's rather insulting? Why not choose a less pejorative name?
We use the name that Danneels gave us. He's the one who confessed everything. He's the one who had the need to boast. His biography was coming out, I believe, in the fall of 2015. And he was on stage, and there's video of him where he's just smiling about the fact that, we called ourselves the mafia. So that's where we, definitely where we get the name from. And Danneels is an incredibly important and disturbing figure, because he, for anyone who doesn't know, he had been caught on tape trying to quiet a sexual abuse victim. And this victim was a man who had been abused by his own uncle, who became a bishop under Danneels. And he had been abused from the age of 5 to 18. And he can be heard on the tape saying things like, "Why are you always taking the side of my abuser? I thought I was coming here to get support from you, and you're always taking his side." So it's really devastating when you actually look at the transcripts. And yet, nevertheless, he begins speaking about how he had a resurrection. That's his imagery, a resurrection under Pope Francis. And he's very important because I think he's where we get the name Francis from. We talked about, you were talking very eloquently about setups. We all know that, the story of how Pope Francis got his name sounds pretty spontaneous and inspired, right? Because Cardinal Humis says, "Don't forget the poor," and a light bulb turns on in Cardinal Bergoglio's mind, who's now Pope Francis, and he just decides to become Francis. Well, Danneels, of all people, I document this in the book. In the 1990s, he was talking about how we need a new Francis. Multiple times he has an essay about it. And he was telling people about it as well. We have documentation of that from the New York Times. And right before the 2013 conclave, he gave a press conference and said, "We need a Francis." So this is another moment where so many of these moments that appear to be like beautifully spontaneous and quaint in that way, they appear to be completely scripted. The spontaneity is completely programmed into them.
Just a quick note before we return. If you would like to stay up to date on LifeSite's coverage of the latest life, family, and culture news, subscribe to one of our many newsletters by going to lifesitenews.com/subscribe. And if you'd like to help us bring our truth-telling coverage to millions around the world, please consider making a one-time or monthly donation at give.lifesitenews.com. And now, back to the video. What's amazing about this, and that hugely close connection there between Danneels and Francis, is that for all the world, and I mean even the secular world, Danneels should have been a total scandal. The reason why he needed to be resurrected, as he said, from by Francis was because he was totally shunted by, well, after he was named cardinal, but nonetheless, shunted by Pope JP2 in the end of his papacy, and also Benedict. Why? Because not only is he on record as having been caught, not only covering up, trying to, as you said, silence a victim about the sexual, incestuous pedophilia of his uncle, who's a bishop under Danneels, but also because in the Catholic world, he was not pro-life at all. In fact, he okayed the King of Belgium to go ahead and legalize abortion. He actually is public about wearing a rainbow stole. This is a scandal to the faith in so many ways, even the secular way, and yet Francis resurrects him in his own words. Let's go on to another one of these figures that I think is really the central character in the story. And this is where we come up with some of the most, and you lay out some of the most fascinating details that explain Francis, that really, for all those of us who are scratching our heads going, where is he going? What is up with this? I can't understand this, Pope. Your book brings a clarity that really is hard to find. And it's because of this connection to the cardinal you mentioned off the top, Cardinal Martini, Archbishop of Milan. Tell us a little bit more about him and his connection to Pope Francis.
He's the center of this book. The book it has many different chapters, many different personalities. For most of the chapters, I try to pick one person to kind of focus on. And then I lay out an issue and a narrative based on that person. So Martini has several chapters, but at the end of the day, he's the catalyst for everything, the center of gravity. And Martini is interesting because we have testimony from Nicholas Diat, who talked to a cardinal. And the cardinal indicated that Martini in the 2005 conclave under no circumstances wanted to support Bergoglio. Silvestrini, who I mentioned earlier, was kind of spearheading the movement for Bergoglio to be backed by the mafia, but Martini was unpersuadable. He would not support Bergoglio. And then something happened, because if you look at the late Martini, Eugenio Scalfari indicates that when Martini was, getting close to his deathbed in the last couple months, he was talking about the positions that he shared with Bergoglio. And then we have at least one of his works, again, I cite it in the book, but where Martini is quoting Bergoglio in his works. Bergoglio loved to quote Martini. We know that from Austin Ivory, who's the papal biographer of Francis. But this was the time Martini was quoting Bergoglio. So they have this interesting dynamic. And then basically what the book tries to lay out is the case that we have the ghost of Cardinal Martini after he dies. And that phrase, ghost of Cardinal Martini, is a very eloquent phrase that the Vaticanista Edward Penton talks about in one of his pieces. And I think for me, if I can just focus on one particular instance here, we've seen Pope Francis go to Eugenio Scalfari, the atheist, for a lot of interviews, right? Now, there are multiple interviews that Martini gave to Scalfari. And one of the interviews talked about the Pope being the Bishop of Rome. And it also talked about having councils, and they would be serial. And one of them would be, the first one, the most important one to have would be on the divorced. And then the second or third most important one would be on priestly celibacy. If this is ringing a bell.
Oh, yeah, it should be. You have Francis, who refers to himself over and over again as the Bishop of Rome. We have this now ongoing synods over and over and over again. And we had the very first one, extraordinary first, on the issue of the family, which was really all about, from its beginning, divorced remarried communion, and spearheaded by Casper. Continue.
We have the Amazon Synod that was supposed to make headway on the ordination of married men. So that's again coming from Martini. And the interesting thing is, when Pope Francis gave that kind of bombshell October 2013 interview with Scalfari, one of the first things that he says in that interview is they're kind of joking, like, Scalfari is saying, "Oh, my friends say you want to convert me." And then Pope Francis assures him he doesn't want to convert him. And then he says, "Proselytism is solemn nonsense," according to the interview, of course. In the Scalfari Martini interview from, I believe, somewhere around 2009, this one that was talking about a council for the divorced, a very similar thing happens at the beginning, where Martini says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to proselytize you." So it's like a very tight connection between the two, I think.
It's amazing, the layout of your book showing basically the plans of the San Gallen Mafia, particularly of Martini, but also even his mentor, layout, and it's even called 100 Days of the First Pope, but the absolute lockstep fashion in which this seems to be rolled out is incredible. One of the things, for instance, that struck me was the issue of the red shoes. Everybody remembers Francis got rid of the red shoes, but where was that in discussion by the San Gallen Mafia?
We have somewhere where Casper was joking about the red shoes, and then we have I found some testimony where Martini's sister was talking about how Martini, as early as like the early 1980s, he didn't like the Red Sox. And I mean, this fixation seems kind of silly, right? The different talking about different items of clothing and everything, but to these men, it was symbolic of a monarchical, princely church versus a down-to-earth, so-called humble church. And the book tries to kind of lay out how we can look at things like the choices about the shoes and everything and see a symbolism, and see how that eventually gets us to the type of person who wants to do that is the same type of person who might wave a white flag of surrender to the dictatorship of relativism, as Benedict called it.
I think one of the most striking things about Pope Francis was in one of the very first interviews, the world was introduced to him, and it was so revolutionary. His comment about homosexuality and same-sex civil relationships, saying, "Who am I to judge?" And if that's basically emblematic of Pope Francis, not only on the issue of homosexuality, but it's sort of like on everything immoral. But even that has its origin not in Pope Francis, but in Martini, if you wouldn't mind explaining.
This is something that the Italian author Antonio Socci really registers and wrote about. Basically, there's this eerie echo that you can hear when you take "Who am I to judge?" and then you take something that Martini said, which is, "I would never think of judging a same-sex couple." I'm loosely paraphrasing it, but the idea, I would never think to judge that, is there. And Sochi heard the connection, and he has a book where, I forget which one of the books it is, but where he takes a bunch of statements from Pope Francis and just puts them side by side with statements from Martini. And he basically says, you know, Francis seems to be using Martini's book, Night Conversations, as a kind of canvas. And again, I mentioned before, but we know from Austin Ivory, the papal biographer, and he was actually the spokesperson for Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who's another mafia member. But we know from him that Bergoglio loved to quote Martini. So sometimes he'll quote, even as Pope now, sometimes he will quote Martini explicitly. And he did that, I think, in December, I want to say 2021. If it wasn't 2021, it was 2020. But he quotes Martini's last speech, where Martini was saying, like, you know, the church is 200 years behind. Why won't the church rouse itself? So he explicitly says that this is from Cardinal Martini. But then he has these other moments where he says things like, we need to listen to the God of surprises, the surprises of the Holy Spirit, that sort of thing. Martini is on record talking about the surprises of the Holy Spirit. So it's very pervasive, definitely.
I want to conclude with this, encourage people really to go out and get your book, San Gallen Mafia, available from Tan Books and publishers, really faithful publishing house. Congratulations on the work, by the way, just amazing. But tell us, because this gives us sort of an indication of where Francis is coming from, one of the big questions we're left with is, where are we heading to? So from your research into the San Gallen Mafia, where is this going? What's the end goal here?
When I finished editing the book, it was the summer, it was, I think, beginning of July. And just like maybe 2 weeks later was when Traditionis Custodes came out. And it's obviously, you know, this kind of attack on the traditional Latin Mass has obviously, you know, it appears to be a devastating one. I think Peter Kwasniewski compared it to a kind of like an atomic bomb, basically. And I was, you know, even as someone who has studied the mafia for this book, you know, I was surprised by what a bombshell, you know, this development was. And I wrote kind of an article that I kind of view as kind of an afterword or companion to the book, because it just talks about how the mafia also had a kind of war against the traditional Latin Mass and Pope Benedict's Summorum Pontificum, which tried to make it more widely available. So I think this is, you know, one of the major battlegrounds that is, you know, it's even worse than I could have anticipated and predicted. And then we have the synod on synodality, this kind of 2-year process. And that just screams Martini, because Martini had this 1999 dream speech where he basically laid out the groundwork for a series of synods. So this was before the Scalfari interview that talked about the Council on the Divorced. And it used code words, but you can read into it, and it's basically the same thing we were talking about. It's things like deaconesses and priestly celibacy and that sort of thing. But to focus so much on making the church synodal, I think it's also incredibly devastating, because Edward Penton has a really great article about how some experts are comparing permanent synodality, which is Martini's idea, to permanent revolution. So to me, what I say to people is these two things, Traditionis Custodes and the Synod on Synodality, it's like the mood of an end game. I mean, these are the prizes now, and I'm incredibly worried, and I think we need to just have a lot of vigilance about this and continue to speak out. We've done this before with other synods, and I think we can do it again. Just, you know, monitoring the situation very, very carefully.
Julia,
I know you as a very faithful Catholic, someone who's very learned and studied, and you've done a lot of research into this. You've seen the muck of things in a way that few people have. How do you maintain your hope? And what do you see as the real end to all of this?
A couple years ago, I think you guys, LifeSite, published a reflection that Matthew McCusker from, I believe, Voice of the Family did about how it's important when you're in the pro-life, pro-family, any one of these movements. It's very important to have something concrete that keeps you hopeful, because it's very, it's very spiritually exhausting work to have to deal with this all the time. And he talks specifically about Fatima and the First Saturday's devotion. And that's something that's really important to me. I like to tell people one kind of way to live out the First Saturday's devotion is if you can do it one time, all 5 Saturdays, you might try doing it kind of like a perpetual first Saturday devotion. So I've done that when I can, where I'll just do another 5 Saturdays. And then if I can, I'll do another 5 Saturdays. But that's something concrete that I think kind of gives us graces to continue on. And in terms of how this ends, it ends with the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. So that's why it's so important. It's important to remember Martini and the St. Gallen Mafia, they don't have the last word on any of this. And it's up to us to be faithful to our vocations and to try to do as Our Lady has asked, and to just have hope that we will see what she has promised.
Amen. Julia Maloney, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of the John Henry Westen Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
May God bless you.
Thank you.
And God bless all of you. We'll see you next time, and make sure to go get Julia's book.
Hi, everyone. This is John Henry Westen. We hope you enjoyed this program. To see more like it, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to get all the latest content from LifeSite News. Check the links in the description to read more and connect with us on social media so that you can stay up to date with all the latest life, family, faith, and freedom news. Thanks for watching, and may God bless you.